Rob, would you like to introduce our guest who needs no introduction, but we're going to introduce him anyway?
Probably doesn't, but because this is going on the podcast and and up on YouTube, and people might hit this one first, they might not know who David is.
Sure.
So David Teachout is a mental health therapist and photographer, focused on and teaching how creativity intersects with mental flexibility. He grew up as a Christian fundamentalist, attending a Bible college, and received a bachelor's in theology and psychology. During his studies there, David deconverted and has been on a journey of appreciating humanity and all the stories we create to build meaning and purpose in our lives. He has a master's in both forensic psychology and counseling psychology, and is currently at work on a doctorate in clinical psychology. David has been actively working within the field of psychology as therapist, social worker, advocate, and subject matter expert for over 15 years. In his spare time, he enjoys reading a copious amount of both fiction, nonfiction, exploring perspectives through photography. I don't even know what that means, and maintains a blog at lifeweavings.com and a podcast at humanitiesvalues.com. So because we're going to be talking about Buddhism tonight, in preparation for tonight's talk, I called out for a takeout order for dinner, and I asked for a sub sandwich, and I told them to make me one with everything. So on to you, David.
Classic. Classic.
How to do
Yes.
it.
That's yeah. It begs for that joke. It does. It does. Yes. So we're gonna be looking at Buddhism today. We'll say that if you're here looking for like a Wikipedia entry, that will not be what this is. And I will note immediately that I do not refer to myself as an expert in Buddhism. It is something that I've been looking at off and on for, I mean, is it kind of like, for everybody who's rational pre deconversion, like everybody goes through an Ayn Rand period, and then after deconversion, like everybody goes through a Buddhist period, like you're just trying to figure, I don't know. So anyway, I went through that. But it just kind of, comes and goes. And actually in preparation for this, definitely back into it. There's a lot of things that I was finding. I'm like, I had no idea that I'd incorporated so much of this into my thinking. So yeah, good. Oh, Wiccan Pagan. Well, I mean, really, I consider the source. I'm not surprised, Miss J. So yeah. Miss J. Totally calling you that now.
Yeah.
That works. Anyway. So actually I want to go to the polls initially, which thank you everybody for having fun with that. No, this will not be about Jordan Peterson. In fact, I will not even be quoting him.
Thank
I
goodness
prefer
for small
never
miracles.
to, yeah.
If you do, please try to
that's
impersonate
okay.
him with the Kermit the Frog voice. I'd love that.
No. So, but it was actually interesting. Why, and a reason why I start here is that one, it was really interesting actually. I was not expecting some of the numbers on these. And so it's just always fascinating to see what's going on. And so part of it is, of course, how things are framed. Like anybody who is research polls at all knows that often the polling question itself will indicate both the bias of the poll list, but also where they're wanting to go. This is one reason why I love answering polls from Fox News, because they're always like specifically in a direction. So it's
Is
so much fun.
Trump the greatest president that ever was, or is he the best president that
Yeah,
ever
like
was?
yes, absolutely yes, yes times infinity. I mean, it's fantastic. So there's a lot there's a lot there, but yeah. So one reason, in fact, what we're going to start off with here is if anybody's is aware of Ninian Smart. He was a Scottish philosopher and psychologist, studied psychology and religion. And he had come up with this idea of the 7 dimensions of religion. And so we'll actually be looking at that initially. And this is like 30, 40 years ago. I think his books are no longer fully in print. So I've found one and have ordered it because clearly I need more books. But there's also a Wikipedia entry that goes into some of his thinking there. We can share if we want. But part of this goes into, like, for instance, 2 people out of 35 mentioned that, you know, Buddhism as a religion is like all religions should be dismissed. Like, yes, true. Okay, interesting. This question very much is about how one considers and looks at religion, and whether or not religion is this kind of monolithic entity, whether or not, you know, they're pretty much all, you know, either one, they're all bad because they're trying to dissuade us from a humanistic perspective, or they're all potentially good because they're all trying to answer, you know, basic questions. You know, can you go from, you know, basically 2 sides of the spectrum here on how
Are you
consider
going to go
things.
into what the difference between a philosophy and because I recall watching live many years ago when Bill O'Reilly came back at somebody and said, "No, Christianity is not a religion; it's a philosophy." And it's like, what?
Right.
No, it's a
Of
personal
all the people, Bill
relationship with
O'Reilly to
Jesus.
even use the term philosophy is that hurts here somewhere. But yeah, well, actually, I thought you were going to say Christianity is not a religion; it's a relationship. And in fact, the reason why some of these phrases get used will actually be touched on through the 7 dimensions. So it's a fascinating way of looking at things. I'd never encountered it before. I have no idea how I stumbled across it. Oh, wait, actually I do. It was in relationship to, is mentioned in Buddhism, a very short introduction. If anybody's, you know, heard me before, I've mentioned the very short introduction series often. In fact, they're all right here on this shelf.
I was about to say, aren't we seeing
And
some of them now? I spy.
yeah, there's like 50 out of the 600 or so that are there. But yeah, they're just a fantastic series and well worth exploring. One of these days I'll be able to get money the more often I mention it, but that day is not today. And so it's a great one. And he actually mentions the Professor Cohen, Keown. I'm going to butcher his name, I'm sure. You know, smarts thing. So it's pretty interesting to go through. And so, of course, that goes into the second one: myths or lies have no place in rational contemplation. Wow, that leaped up. When I first saw it, it was 1 person said yes, and we were at 8. So consider the audience, I guess. And rather fun. Want to pick and choose what myths to explore. So we'll go into, you know, a bit of what myths are and what they are not, and the assumptions that we often bring to them, which will, you know, yeah. If you want the tailor-made person about assumptions concerning myths, that would be JP. So, and then looked into Buddhism before. Find it intriguing, rather fun that there was 13 that said yes, and there are actually 3 of you. This was 0 before when I first looked. If I was forced to pick a religion, this is the one I pick. So fun. Let's see. I had to put this one on here. Why, you know, and I'm tired of Buddhism being brought up by atheists. I mean, yeah, I've heard it stated a few times, like, really? Everybody's just going after this. And there is a lot of overlap with Stoicism. There absolutely is. So, which is fascinating as to why that might be. Won't go into that very much, but while we're studying and exploring, all of you kind of sociological archaeologists out there, you know, to explore that. And then the
I'll
last
try
one
not
is
to get
just
too
a silly
excited.
one. Yeah. The
Couldn't
last one
resist.
is just, I mean, because I couldn't, yeah, I love all of the superhero movies. So I'm just, yeah, get my nerd on. let's see what happens.
Now, I'm going to need you to
Yeah.
explain this one to me. I'm being a bad nerd at the moment.
Well, that's actually two of us, Kara. Yeah, I'm pretty much up on this, and I don't know who those two people are.
Yeah, what is happening that we need to know
Oh,
about here?
Well, because it's DC and not Marvel,
yeah. So
probably. You know,
Shots
right.
fired.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So DC's been taken over by, or been given over to the movie franchise to James Gunn and Peter Safran
yeah.
to basically create a metaverse, much like the Marvel universe has been creating MCU, because they finally looked around 10 years too late, probably, and went, "Oh my God, we're not making nearly as much money as the MCU, and maybe we should have a coherent idea of how to put all these movies together." And so
I
they were
get you.
given to these two guys, which would be really interesting to see where they go with things. But yes, there's a lot of controversy because Henry Cavill, so delicious, is no
Yes.
longer
Superman? Wait, Henry Cavill,
Superman.
Superman? Yeah.
Yeah, he's also no longer The Witcher. I mean,
How
yeah,
did that
sad
happen?
face. Very sad
Oh,
face.
I
Lots of
am sad
things.
about that.
Just lots of things.
Yeah, I'm gonna
Yeah.
be honest. I thought that maybe Gunn and
Yeah.
Safran were characters that you were shipping from some kind of like fan
That's
fiction
what I
archive.
thought.
I'm sure there's some kind of fan fiction out there about it.
Oh,
Yeah.
I said that one time about a different show that I was talking to some friends about, and years later, I still haven't gotten to the end of the list of fan fictions of Supernatural. Turns out that's a whole thing.
It's a whole thing. And I
Whole
loved
thing.
every season. Oh, beautiful. Yeah. So
I did too. And I don't
anyway,
normally like a
anybody
season
wants
of
to
anything
completely
for
nerd
15
out,
seasons unless it's Star Trek.
it's true. Yeah. So if anybody wants to nerd out even more, I will totally be hanging out afterwards, so we can, nerd out to our heart's content. So returning to the actual topic that we're looking at, and interesting. I will come back to that question. So when it comes to questions, anybody who's seen me present before knows that I kind of fly by the seat of my pants a bit, and largely because I like to respond to questions as they go and make this as organic as possible. So if there are questions that I see pop up in the chat that I think are pertinent to the immediate moment, I will attempt to address them. If not, definitely we will be keeping track of them and we'll look at them at the end. Yeah. Yeah, we'll get into reincarnation a bit. It is and isn't a Buddhist idea, so it's a little peculiar. Yeah, in fact, one of the immediate difficulties when looking at Buddhism is that it's really more of Buddhisms, because one, you have the two central or main schools of Mahayana and Theravada, but as well you then have the Japanese version, which there are like two or three versions there, including Zen. There's the Tibetan Tantric version. There's a lot of different things that happen, largely because for two reasons. One, when Siddhartha Gautama, who was referred to as Buddha, or initially just great teacher, but when he taught what he did, he left without any kind of authoritative writings. He didn't say, "This is the only way," kind of thing. And so as a consequence, he left it up to his followers. Like, this is about your own personal exploration. Go forth and multiply. So, and they did, because humankind is, if it's anything, it is a faction one. So we love creating our groups and then telling the other groups that we're better than they are. So it's just, we love it. And so so one, it was that, and then two, historically, Buddhism has a tendency, contrary, in contradiction to like Christianity and Islam, that when they enter into a new land, they tend to just simply incorporate a lot of the ideas, even parallel Like, it's really not a big surprise to walk into a village that the Buddhists come into and go, sure, ancestor worship, and then go to the monk here for wisdom about your longevity in life or whatever. I mean, it's not a problem because so much of it has to do with one's personal journey and towards enlightenment. So it's so because of those two things, everything kind of blew up, and we've got factions everywhere. And so, which is where a lot of it comes into, like, for instance, reincarnation earlier was mentioned, and which it is and isn't within Buddhism. So there are certain ideas that we generally think of as, oh, this is Buddhism, and it's more closely aligned with Mahayana as opposed to the Theravada branch, which we'll get into a little bit of what those differences are. But coming back a little bit, so Ninian Smart wanted to have an exploration of basically the meaning-making process that human beings engage in that manifest, at least in this way, through religious lenses. And so in the way that both he, several others, myself actually as well, look at religion is actually as it's not a thing in itself. It's not like it got, spontaneously erupted and emerged out of something. It's a active participatory engagement with reality as a way of helping make sense of our existence, albeit within the constant limited information that we all have. So in a sense, religion is like a science. It's on a trajectory of limited information and trying to make sense of what we think about ethically. What do we think about meaning and purpose, and how do we make sense of why do things happen the way they do? Now, granted, the information was even more limited, and in fact, there's I totally forget the guy's name, so we have to look it up. But the book was titled "From Religion to Philosophy," and it was basically an exploration of how religion started as an initial way of answering inquiry, and eventually moved into philosophy, which eventually led us into science. Because
Is it F.M.
this whole
Hornford?
process.
Oh, sorry.
Maybe. Yeah.
Okay.
It wouldn't surprise me if there's several of the same title kind of thing. But
okay. Carry on.
It's a way of looking at this. There's some questions as to whether or not this is really how that worked, but I find it a helpful way of looking at how we tend to view things in the trajectory of human knowledge. But so in a sense, any time that you're looking at a religion is that you can initially look at it from the perspective of it is an attempt at creating a sense of meaning and understanding about one's existence and role in life and so on, which, welcome to all of us. We've all got big old fat question marks as to what the hell we're doing. And all of them are various attempts at trying to figure all that out to varying degrees of success. And in fact, and this goes into about what they are and where are the similarities, what are the differences, and how to analyze them as parts of a whole rather than whole things in themselves. So broke it into, like, there's the practical and ritual part of religions. There's the things that we do in order to generate a particular type of meaning. There's the experiential or emotional component. So Rudolf Otto referred to this as, the numinous, which is, it's an idea there, well worth studying his writing on that. The conversion of Apostle Paul, I mean, it's an experiential part. It also tends to dovetail into the mythic, which we'll get into that here in a second.
Wait,
The
what was
visions
the
of
thing you
Muhammad
said
also.
right before the conversion of John? What was that?
Oh, the idea of the numinous,
Numinous.
Rudolf Otto was a philosopher who explored that.
Numinous.
There we go. So definitely worth taking a look at. It's just an interesting thing to like. Oh, okay. And so, and these things tend to dovetail into the third category, which is the mythic or narrative portion. So it's where we often will go to when understanding religions. We'll go immediately to the stories that they share, and then often write writ large, like, oh, this is all that it is. Maybe it doesn't have to be. For instance, one of my favorite examples is Catholicism. Because there are a number of people out there that are full-on agnostic or atheist who still attend Catholic Church, who still, engage in a lot of the rituals for it, not because they agree with the myths behind it, not necessarily that they agree certainly with the doctrines behind them, but they appreciate what the rituals are attempting to do, how they bring people together. They'll look at it from a very broader perspective of how you can create meanings to it. And so we get into this whole thing around how when we start looking at these various ways of looking at religion, it's very easy to just go, well, this ends up being effectively, see atheists and humanists do this all the time, where it's like, you call yourself this name, but you don't agree with certain aspects of it, therefore you're not actually a real believer in this. And
the no
thing
true
of it
Scotsman
is that,
fallacy specifically.
right, which is hilarious, because that's exactly what the various sects of that religion are often doing to one another. So all we're doing is perpetuating the, frankly, bullshit of that there is this monolithic version that has never changed, and there's never been any various iterations throughout history. And the thing is, we know better. Christianity, for instance, clearly has never had a single line of doctrine. It has been all over the map.
I
When
get
it comes to things. In fact,
two flavors of callers on the helpline. Most of them are my religion, my little piece of Christianity specifically, is the only correct one. But there have been a number of people who did not know there were other versions or other, as you're saying, evolutionary changes. No, it's always been this way. Everyone who's a Christian believes what I believe. That shocked me.
Yeah. Yep. And good. We should, in fact, if anything, we should be encouraging that. We should be encouraging anybody we come across who is going, there are various ways of looking at this. The monolithic thing is what we don't want. In fact, when I get to the end here, basically 3 principles that I'm deriving from studying Buddhism here that I think can be really helpful in not only mental health, but personal endeavors and so on. And one of them alludes to that idea that there is some singularity to any particular group or ideology rather. And the more we in fact encourage people to go, oh, there's actually been a lot of different iterations of this, and this people over here did this, the better we get at diminishing the power of any of a particular version to become ascendant. It's like what we have, in fact, is in here is almost like a push for a small degree of partisanship when it comes to ideologies. Like, we want the competition. We want people to be sitting around going, well, maybe kind of this, maybe over there, because where we get a lot of the problems is when a single form or version, we have the kind of a monopolistic from a social perspective on ideology, and that never helps. Like, history is replete with examples of when there's a singular idea that, or version of an idea that gains ascendancy, it never really turns out very well. Because again, we're humans, and when we don't have much in the way of competition with our ideas, we tend to be assholes about it.
Well,
So
and
it's
you can't
just,
grow and
it's kind of a
change.
problem.
You know, if you think that you
No,
have the one true belief that's always been this way and it can never change, then you can't ever change your mind on anything. If you meet somebody that challenges your perspective, or if you learn new information,
yeah.
what are you going to do with that? You're going to have cognitive dissonance, I guess, forever.
Well, that's, yeah. So this goes. I love you bringing it up, because this goes into, cognitive dissonance, which I've actually presented on before. Is actually, I take it as less of a negative and more of a positive. Not only one, because I think our brains are constantly in a dissonant state. In fact, most of the time, what we're doing is engaging in behavior to avoid that dissonance. But in fact, the dissonance is where creativity occurs. The dissonance is where we recognize the probabilistic nature of all knowledge and go, even if we're, oh gosh, 99.9% sure, that this one particular thing in a particular context is true, there may very well come upon, some other, point down the road that goes, wait, so it's one of the things I work with pretty much all my clients, is not only from an acceptance commitment therapy perspective of holding thoughts lightly, but is to basically acknowledge that literally everything we do and say and think is to some degree inaccurate or wrong. Now, it could be a small degree, could be a huge degree. We don't know. But the more we sit there with the acceptance of, I'm probably missing something, because you are. We literally can't hold everything at any single conscious state. So the more we hold that in, kind of like, oh wow, let's see what's possible. It does not mean, to throw out the caveat, this does not mean some kind of subjectivism. This does not mean the truth doesn't matter, or anything like that. It just means the capital T truth, the absolutism that of which we are all prone to, not just those who are involved in religion, is something we need to constantly be working against. And so, and that's part of where Nini and Smith's, the 7 dimensions help us with this, because we can look at, for instance, how the personal or the experiential will often dovetail into the mythic, which itself will then dovetail and be reciprocally related to rituals, which then can be tied into institutions as well, and go, okay, so why do I have a problem, for instance, with a particular doctrine? Well, yeah, there is part of what it says, but it also is because it relates back to as well how we create our institutions, how we create our social connections. The doctrine, for instance, it's like you mentioned earlier, the LGBTQ, plus group, and for RfR, and going, the reason why the doctrines that have been created around being anti various, sexual proclivities is wrong, is not just the doctrine itself. It's the ramifications of what it has in social and ethical practice. So it's not just simply some kind of detached philosophy. It has a connection to, which is where we get at times into some of the discussions we can have with people, is if we start and end only with the doctrines, which I see a lot of people doing. I used to do it myself, particularly when I first got out of Christianity. It was like, wow, there's these issues with the Bible, as if there's one version. And it's like, and this is a contradiction here, this is a contradiction there. And it's like, it's a waste of freaking time, because, or the old question of, did Jesus exist? I mean, to all power to those who have dedicated their entire, educational lives to figuring that question out. But I just don't care, because whether or not such a person existed is secondary to how that person's, the stories, the myths that have emerged out of it, have been used in conjunction with then generating particular experiential moments that then generate particular doctrines that then generate social things. You see where, like, as we break these things down, we have a greater degree of being able to have a conversation, and not only where we might actually find some kind of commonality, but further, where we also will then be able to have the chinks within the armor of one's belief where we can eventually go, oh, maybe I'm not as right as I thought. And as far as I'm concerned, that's a win. I don't care whether you start religious or otherwise. Like, anytime we get to the point of being able to say, I don't know, and I'm actually okay saying that I don't know, is a win for humanity, for that matter.
Yeah. Well, and I feel like that, for a
Wanted
lot
to
of
say something.
people is what is so comforting sometimes about sticking to a particular belief system, especially if it is really heavy on the doctrine and understanding that this is 100% true. You don't have to do the uncomfortable work of thinking that you might be wrong, which is uncomfortable. Like, nobody wants to be wrong. And I feel
Right.
like, I mean, I don't like it. It happens to me all the time, and it's terrible. But that's how we learn
Yep.
things.
And I
Well,
like the expression
and there's
surrounding
a
that being wrong feels exactly like being right because you don't know it.
yep. You don't, yeah. Well, that and the feeling about it. I mean, this is Catherine Schultz's book, Being Wrong, Adventures on the Margin of Error. Highly recommend. I think I've probably mentioned it often. But she mentions it because the feeling of being wrong is a lot like the feeling of being right, because you're like, man, I was right about being wrong. I mean, it's just there's still that confirmation, because any belief that we have, and do promise this does tie immediately back into Buddhism here, is that any belief we have is not just some kind of like mental firing. It's a way of relating us to and within reality as we know it. So it's one of the things we work with a lot of people on, like, for instance, boundaries. We often will consider boundaries as some kind of wall that we put up in order to keep things from happening to us. And on the contrary, actually look at boundaries as the behaviors, both intellectual and active, that we do to define the relationships that we're in all their various kinds. So boundaries are the ideas we hold about ethics. They are the ideas we hold about our own sexuality and identity. They are also the behaviors that we do when we define whether or not a person's a friend, an intimate partner, a family member, a coworker, and so on. These variations in how we relate to one another are the boundaries saying, oh, this is who we are together. And so as we explore these things, the beliefs are not just simply some mental thing. They are the means through which people are understanding reality, which is, again, why people get rather upset when you start attacking them or having issues around being wrong, because it's never just some kind of intellectual exercise. It is always about something more than that. It's survival from a psychological perspective. And in fact, part of this is actually what the Buddha mentioned and talked about. So he went through this notion of that. Let's see if I can just create. Yeah. So Stephen Bachelor, who was a ordained monk, he actually did a lot of translation work for the Dalai Lama. Confessions of a Buddhist Atheist is amazing. Buddhism Without Beliefs was the first book I ever read of his. That just stellar reflection, and he, through the process of a lot of the translations that he was doing and a lot of the work that he was doing. So understand, when we look at translations, it's also for Buddhists, translations, doing the translation exercise here is not just some academic exercise. It is a spiritual discipline. It is a way of communing with, the way of viewing the world. So those who engage in interpretation is not necessarily a calling to quite do that, but it is something that is highly revered. So when you're so for him to do this, his bona fides are well established. But in the process of doing a lot of these interpretations, a lot of the translations, a lot of the study and contemplation that he did, eventually he kind of did a Thomas Jefferson on Buddhism, where he just kind of got rid of all of the supernatural elements that had creeped in over the hundreds of years since Buddha, and went, wait a minute, let's try to get as close to what he was talking about, and excise a lot of this excess and see what remains. And that's where you get Buddhism Without Beliefs, where he works through a lot of those ideas. I have heard of Mark Gurrow. Definitely, he's a great advocate, good person to read. We'll get into a list of all the books later. If anybody has seen me present before, basically you have about a dozen after every time I'm done of things to read. So look me up on
Following
Goodreads.
you now on Goodreads.
Yes. I know, I saw. It's fun.
Yes, I'm constantly inspired to get my reading caught up when I see you've read 8 books in a week or something.
A lot of their fiction, but still. So did the concept of hells exist? So this is one of those where it didn't at the beginning. So here's where we get into some of the basic split between Mahayana and Theravada Buddhism. And the Mahayana tradition basically went down the path of saying, what the Buddha, what Gautama, said at the beginning was the kind of initial revelation, to use a Western idea here. And the initial Dharma that was being shared, it wasn't complete. It was kind of like a parent who was, saying things simplistically to his children. And so miraculously, of course, those who are espousing this idea then say, but we have the second turning of that wheel, so you have to listen to us. How convenient. So you have an entire tradition then that spun off of that. This is where you get into the sutras. One of the most popular ones, Lotus Sutra, where so you have these kind of extra ideas that have been added on. And so the notion of, if anybody's aware of or have heard the term bodhisattva, that comes out of the Mahayana tradition. So bodhisattvas are teachers that have dedicated themselves to actively continuing in the reincarnation path in order to continue leading people to nirvana, even as they themselves are not going there yet. So it got to the point where they the bodhisattvas were lauded even more than Gautama himself. Excellent referral to Alan Watts. He is phenomenal to listen to. Definitely more of the Zen Buddhist tradition, and which is, of course, almost, I swear, it's almost like I post the question to myself. Koans are where you get in with Zen Buddhism, which is more Japanese. In fact, there could be an entire study, in fact, I'm sure there are, on how the various subculture or various cultures that Buddhism went into shifted and manifested various forms of Buddhism in it. So, for instance, the kind of original Buddhism that is related more towards Theravada, and they, is what's more individualistic. The idea of you work out your own kind of, I'm going to use the term salvation, not quite what would be referred to. You work out your own individual path to the end of suffering or nirvana. And whereas Zen went into more of a communal, they focused on social connections, which, unsurprisingly, came out of Japan. Much more of a communal society, much more an idea of taking care of people next to you, taking care of your family, and so on. So it's a fascinating way of, and again, why we come back to, and why it can be really helpful to look at these, any religion, including Buddhism, through these 7 dimensions, because it allows us to be able to parse out and go, oh, why was this developed? Quite often, if not almost always, it's never for the explicit purpose of control. People will use it, obviously, because anybody who's in power wants to keep it, and so they'll use whatever tools available. But often it was developed precisely to address a particular cultural aspect that it was evolving out of. And so, and then it's gone down through the ages that where we're like, oh, well, now what do we do with it? So a lot of different things there. But fundamentally, so have the idea here of, and what Bachelor referred to as he actually draws from Martin Heidegger, and which is a European philosopher, and he refers to how being in the world, what the Buddha referred to. I'm going to get the exact phrasing wrong here for a second, but what he referred to as being the presence in the moment. It's this kind of co-occurring process that as we develop our ideas, as we engage in reality, we are being shaped by the context in which we are in, while also shaping it. And there was this notion of a non-separation, which for people who are, somewhat, familiar, the idea of a no mind notion here is a direct derivation from this. If there is no separation at a certain level, then there is no self. There is no singular thing that is you, because you are constantly being developed in your, through your experience, and not only your experience, but the stories you have about it. Mm-hmm. Anybody who's, listening here, it's like, Kara included, like, we look back at some of our own deconversion stories and how often the initial story we had, how, what is it? It's like, not only does everybody go through like an Ayn Rand period, but everybody goes through like a really pissed off period post conversion. And it's like the stories we have are like, screw this, I was wronged, and I want to burn it all down. And to some degree, I might be just simply repeating what I thought, but anyway, it's like we go through this period of like just really being upset. And so, and yet as we hopefully, as we move on and try out new ideas and mature very lightly, we hope to get to, out the other end of it going, yes, the angry atheist faith. It's like we hope to get past enough to then being able to say, oh, I understand better why I believed at the time. That, understand why, for instance, say, parents, brought me to church, or, why they, enforce this. It wasn't often, sometimes, admittedly, it wasn't because you just awful people or wanting to spread a lie. Quite the opposite. You literally think it's true. So, of course, if you think that something, your ideology is not only true, but it's the path to salvation that will, keep you from eternal damnation, of course you're going to share it. How awful would you be if you didn't? Like, it would make no sense not to share something that was believed to be so, viscerally, accurate. And so it's not, again, that we have to agree with any of it, but eventually we get to this idea of, oh, right, okay, there's a little bit more nuance to this. I can soften my way of how I view myself, perhaps. I can soften my way of how I view maybe perhaps some other people in my life, my past. And so we move on a little bit. That is a different story from the anger period. And notice that behaviors shift as these stories develop. We're not, hanging out in, in chat rooms, haranguing, the believers anytime we want, and taking pride in getting kicked out of, various groups. Instead,
You're very
kind of
optimistic, David.
I mean,
You
yeah,
see the best in
optimistic.
people.
You try. Yeah.
I want to ask you
Nobody
about
would ever
the
really
opposite side of this, David, because
mistake me for an optimist.
I've
Yeah.
had this conversation with people on the helpline, and it kind of happened with my own family when they all converted to evangelical Christianity. Initially they're on your ass to save you, right? Because as you said, what kind of, family would they be if they didn't do that? Then eventually they take the hint it's not working and they totally drop you like a hot potato and back off. So that's a little weird.
Yeah.
If they really believe your family one is going to hell forever and be tortured, okay, I'm done with you. Goodbye. Like, that doesn't seem right either. One could possibly get angry at that.
Good. Well, and so what's interesting there is that now we have a kind of experiential, example of what emphasis people put on the various aspects of their religious ideology. We know the people who, for instance, like I mentioned before near the beginning, where call themselves, Roman Catholic, and yet no, a lot of this is myth. A lot of this is more, some contemplative practice. In fact, there's been a rise in just in Christianity in general, in the contemplative traditions, going back all the way to Erasmus, and very different. Anybody who's ever, was it Miss? I'm gonna blank on the name, but Carolyn Miss, where it's nothing more. I mean, it's still Christianity, but it's Christianity that is detached from most of the doctrines that we tend to associate with, and it's almost entirely about finding some kind of subjective peace within your own spiritual enlightenment. I'm not saying I agree with any of that. But it's a fascinating exploration of, like, when you focus almost exclusively on the experiential part of a religious ideology, where do you run with this? If you focus almost exclusively on, a particular doctrine, I like to say that I can pretty much get along with most believers of any ideology, so long as they're not, strict doctrinal fundamentalists. Because once you focus so exclusively on words and their particular phrasing, there's not a whole lot of room to, have a conversation. It's just like, well, this is the only way I can, do this. It's where, in fact, recent example out of Islam, for instance, there was a big kerfuffle over, I'm forgetting the college, but it was an art class where the professor shared a artistic rendering of Muhammad. had told people ahead of time, this is what's going to happen. The artist was in fact a Muslim, was asked hundreds of years ago when he was asked he was commissioned by a Muslim prince. Like everything was going on, and yet you had a small group of people who decided to make a protest out of it and say, this is going to trigger, Muslims in the class because of the problems of not depicting, Muhammad and so on and so forth. And what was missed in all of the coverage of this, well, a lot of the coverage of this, was that it's a minority opinion. Like, this whole notion that you're not supposed to share images was not only one, not a doctrine in Islam at the beginning, it developed much later, but two, it's not even shared by all Muslims everywhere. So what we're doing in this coverage and in exploration of this was essentially allowing this small group, and who knows even what they were actually after, being little shits. But it's like we're just wanting to do this, and we're allowing them to paint an entire group on one ideological focus, which is only going to encourage further absolutist thought and reaction. That in fact the coverage itself ended up not allowing for the creativity, the notion of pluralism within ideological structures to exist, which is exactly where we need if we're going to be able to have room for dialogue and allow people to have various behavioral changes. So it's just another example of like when we catch ourselves going, all fill in the blank believe this, I can almost guarantee you that is not true. It's just not. So you might be able to say a very particular group does, but that you can say about anybody. Of course, the Westboro Baptist, group, which even then calling it a group is a bit of a misnomer because it's just basically all one very weirdly connected family. It's like using them to say, well, this is what Christianity believes. Talk about the lowest hanging fruit on the tree here.
Well, yeah,
this is really not helpful.
It's not, and that I'm so glad you brought that up. That's one of the things that really bugs me sometimes with like people trying to almost do this virtue signaling act of saying, I went and read an article about this other group of people, and now I know all about them, and I'm going to respect their beliefs and do this and that. And it's so close to just making a mockery, of the people that you're claiming to be respecting, because it's so lacking in nuance, and it's almost just like creating a stereotype all over again. You don't mean to be doing that, but it is what is happening, I think, in a lot of cases. And yeah, we really should be more careful about that.
You think so? Yeah, it's ideological tokenism. It is really what it is. I mean, it's not helpful. It's not helpful when we have our one black friend or one gay friend. Like, oh my God, like no, you don't speak for the whole. Like, one, your skin color, your sexual orientation literally has no actual connection to what you should or shouldn't believe. So this is, it's absurd. I always love going into groups with like, oh, here's my, gay Trump supporting, friend. This is like, she's just like, what? Like your brain just kind of split in two, and it's like, well, I don't have to agree with one aspect, even as I can appreciate the other and go, wow, this doesn't make any sense to my head, but now we have something to talk about. Like, how does this work? Just as we split together, like, what is a person focusing on that is so important to them? For instance, like in the 7 dimensions, and all of these can be broken down into other beliefs as well. And in fact, so this is, and I will see, I'm going to come back finally to the being in the world point. And Bachelor went on to note how, being in the world means that I am inextricably knit into the fabric of this fluid, indivisible, and contingent reality I share with others. There is no room for a disembodied mind or soul, however subtle, to float free from this condition, to contemplate it from a hypothetical Archimedean point outside. Without such a mind or soul, it is hard to conceive of anything that will go on into another life once this one comes to an end. My actions, like the words of dead philosophers, may continue to reverberate and bear fruits long after my death, but I will not be around to witness them. And it's this co-creative relationship that we have. And this is, where we get into fundamentally, it's like, we get into the description that I had written for, this presentation, and went into the, the idea of, Buddhism isn't quite a religion, it's a philosophy. And which is actually an idea that I will often spouted, thinking I was really smart. And, and the reality is it is a religion, but it's also a philosophy. And it's also an ethic. And if we wanted to bring in, this to a singular point, then the ethic of it is at the corner, is at the foundation of what, Siddhartha wanted, to explore. Because when we get into, say, the Four Noble Truths, when we get into the path of what it means to work away from suffering, away from, kind of malignant joining with reality, when we're working away from that and go down, the Eightfold Path, he's referring to this notion of as you create, so you are bringing about. And so, which is actually one of the lessons that got reconnected again, I think, with me in looking at this, is this profound notion of what it means to engage in a particular ethical, life, and how we relate to one another. And so, in the idea then behind this was to, so the idea of, for instance, craving, what, the Sanskrit was referred to as tana, was, I didn't memorize that. I actually have notes. So, the second truth of the Four Noble Truths was around this state of arising, in the sense of this state of connection that we keep having and can't seem to get rid of. And that's part of what this process within Buddhism was attempting to do, was to actually separate that process so we could go, not tied to this one thing. I'm not tied to this, particular geography. I'm not tied to this particular characteristic. I'm not, holistically defined by, a particular label. That as I remove myself from these things, as I recognize that as a condition, that they are ephemeral, that I can create a more, coherent and ethical and peaceful, life by, ceasing these relationships that I'm having. Of course, I'm using the term relationship broadly. This does not mean some ascetic thing where you go off into a cave and ignore everybody in the whole world. In fact, if anything, that was actually part of the story of Gautama, where he tried it and eventually realized this is silly, and stopped it, because the whole notion of denying everything was just not helpful at all.
Yes, somebody asked in the chat earlier about that, can you take it too far? How do you not become attached to not being attached?
Yes. Well, and, the non-attachment is an interesting, one, because we're using a Western term there, and which is, and it's often been, at this point now, there's so much pop psych around, what attachment style are you? And, and which is, not at all how it was intended. But we have this notion of non-attachment, meaning that it's non-caring, which is not at all. If anything, it was quite the opposite. It was the acknowledgement that one can care even as you acknowledge that this too will pass. That I can care about this person, for instance, in front of me, even as I hold the space for the acknowledgement that each and every moment they are effectively dying into and fulfilling the next, almost like a quantum collapse, where, we are constantly evolving into this next state of being if we only will, reflectively consider it strong enough to be able to see, oh, I see where I've come from. Here's where I'm at. Here's where I would like to go. Even if I don't always know what that might be. And being able to care for somebody in such a way to allow for that space for that person to change, to express it, like how amazing is that? I mean, there's the idea of, for that matter, forgiveness.
So it kind of goes back to what you were talking about earlier then about holding things lightly, where if you're holding something lightly, then you can also hold perhaps two contradictory things at once, rather than being so laser focused on one thing that you can't see any other possibilities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Got it.
Well, and we've all, how often have we, any of us, considered, or made the statement of, I'm just fill in the blank, usually a negative. I can only do this, and there we are attaching ourselves to a singularity that is not actually true. Not only is it not true in its descriptive power, but it's not true even in reality. Like there is no particular principle that is going to allow for no change whatsoever for all time. Like it's not going to be able to do that. And so to hold ourselves accountable to a very particular way of viewing ourselves, particularly if we do so through a characteristic of which we had no power over, i.e., sexual orientation, race, skin color, whatever, hair color, lack thereof. Like, I mean, it's just like, there's no reason to hold oneself to this singular, form. And so a lot of this goes to then, certain principles that can come out of it, which is, mentioned before already, looking at the time, of ethics being an attempt at creating a transcendent structure for one's place in the universe. An attempt, not a solution. It's an attempt. So as we consider how we relate to one another, being able to look at how we do so through the lens of we are not just simply figuring out how I relate, but what world I'm trying to create. We step outside of just this and see this. Look around and consider where are the ripple effects to this of what we're doing. It's very similar to Kant's categorical imperative. It's if you can run this all the way and make it universal, is it still something that you would still want to apply? And so Keown notes that these world systems are thought to undergo cycles of evolution and decline lasting billions of years. They refer to them as eons. They come into being, endure for a time, slowly disintegrate before being destroyed in a great cataclysm. In due course, they evolve again to complete a vast cycle known as a great eon. Naturally, the beings who inhabit the physical universes are not affected by these events. And indeed, there is some suggestion that it's the moral status of the inhabitants that determines the fate of the world system. So there is this, and it's a, tie into certain streams of progressivism. There's tie into, for that matter, it's also a principle in a lot of basic conservative thought, that as you act, so you are creating the world you're stepping into. It's why legislating morality has been such a strong impetus for so long, because they're effectively declaring, if I say this is what is going to make the world be. I mean, it's the constant joke of, I was seeing a post on Facebook the other day around, it's like, Jesus came back, came one time as a savior. He's going to come back as a conquering, conqueror later. And please, make it be. Of course, they've been saying this for 2,000 years. Of course, they're always right. But, it's just, but the action there, I mean, the entire doctrine, for instance, of, postmillennialism is based on the idea of, you have created enough of a heaven on earth through the taking over by Christian believers that Jesus goes, thank you. Come in now. And so it's literally this notion of what we are instantiating is what we are then, building. So there's this relationship that we're constantly having with reality itself.
And I take
And
it
so,
you don't mean Gen Z when you say post-millennialism.
No.
No?
But, it took me a half second there to figure out what you'd done. Wow. Caffeine must be wearing off. Yeah.
Yeah, that's all I got. I didn't have any more puns at the moment, but
it's just pretty close.
close as I could get.
Want to return real quick? There's a comment about, seems a central tenet of Buddhism is the cessation of suffering as possible, but it isn't true. Therefore, as nice as it seems, its delusional thought system causes harm. So here's the one caveat. Siddhartha himself actually noted that he really didn't do much in defining what nirvana was, and didn't really talk about it a whole lot. In fact, when he was asked to define it more thoroughly, he's like, the point is not to reach this. The point is not to spend all our time contemplating, what this state of existence would be like. It's kind of like, what's the old, frankly, Christian thing, where it's so heavenly minded that they were no earthly good. I mean, it basically was making a very similar kind of, idea of going, look, you're so focused on the cessation of this that you're ignoring the whole process that is helping us create the world as we engage in it. And so there is a tendency to, if you take this to an extreme, that it can be very harmful, much the same way for that matter as the sin nature. If you harp on that to the exclusion of most other things, definitely problematic, to put it lightly. Same thing around, certain iterations of the term jihad. It's like most religions have ideas, kernels of ones at times, that if you take to an extreme, if you take to a certain conclusion and say it's a conclusion, and then ignore everything else that came before it, you're definitely going to have a lot of awful things come out of it, which is going to be the true of pretty much anything. I mean, it's one of those where, in fact, this goes into, third principle here that I'm totally stealing from Jonah Goldberg, actually. He's a political writer these days. But he refers to it as Paracelsus's dictum. And Paracelsus was a German Renaissance philosopher and chemist. And he coined the idea of like the dose makes the poison. Or as he put it, what is there that is not poison? All things are poison and nothing is without poison. Solely the dose determines that a thing is not a poison. Considering the fact that you can actually get poisoned by water excess. Oxygen poisoning is a thing. Like, you can have too much, yes, of a good thing, In fact, you can look it up. There were actually a few people. There were these water drinking whatever exercise. It was a game, and people died. Like
Yes,
they
I did
stopped
read
them.
about that.
It was a competition. That was the word I was looking for.
Actually,
Yeah, it
many
was a
many
competition. They drank too much.
thousands of people die by dihydrogen monoxide death every year.
It's
Exactly.
true. Yeah.
So,
So
it
extremism
was,
is
yeah, there was
bad,
also a
is
hazing
is what
thing.
we're saying.
Yeah. And and not only is extremism bad, but I actually want to make a bigger principle behind it is that when we're discussing ideas, when we're exploring various things, that we avoid focusing exclusively on extreme examples because it doesn't actually reveal very much of a way of truth. It's like nationalism. As Goldberg put, it's like his biggest thing is he harps on like nationalism is like salt. A little bit, kind of nice. Like let's understand, like there's certain good quality behind recognizing a communal, way of looking at one another. Too much of it, yeah, all we have to do is look at World War II. I mean, it's like really like you put too much salt on something like, this is a problem. So, but at the same token, we want to, when looking at ideas, we also want to be careful around how we look at them and look at it, go, okay, so this is an interesting idea, kind of like the cessation of suffering. Like, okay, this is really interesting. If I exclusively focus on this, yeah, that could lead me down a path where I'm doing entirely too much avoidance, and here's the problem. So, there's, so one way of avoiding this tendency is to bring this a little bit full circle, is back to the cognitive dissonance idea, to actively hold multiple ideas in tension, to be able to say, yeah, some of this, I don't entirely know how they work, but perhaps in the friction between them, I might be able to figure out something else and it'll allow for some other growth to occur. And who knows what'll develop, but could be fun to find out. And to continually do that can be one kind of fun, if a little nerve-wracking at times. Because again, we don't like being wrong, and effectively holding multiple ideas in tension is to get used to the idea that we are wrong all the time.
Yeah, that's
But
the tough
that
part.
is, it is, yeah. But that's where we get back to. There was a poem. One of the things Buddha mentioned was that no conditions are permanent. No conditions are reliable. Nothing is self. Hold that. No conditions are permanent. By conditions was meant literally all ideas, things, places. No conditions are reliable. Everything changes. Nothing lasts forever, including nothing is self.
They need to hire you to do the morning affirmations on my Headspace app. This sounds very familiar to me. I love that. That's very just kind of, you're gonna be okay kind of feeling, and I love that. I just move through the tension, get comfortable with being uncomfortable sometimes, right? And then that's how you learn. Well, I love that. And we are getting close to the end of our time here. Other than that nugget, which I think is quite good, do you have anything else that you want to leave us with? Any last words or book recommendations before we go to the Q&A?
I mean, yeah, always have a list. But if
I'll
anybody's,
drop the list in the
there's,
chat.
one of the books that awesome. In fact, one of the books on the list that you drop here in a second is Destructive Emotions, which it's part of a series of dialogues between the Dalai Lama and various neuropsychologists, philosophers, and others. That particular one was written by Daniel Goleman. But there's ones on like dreaming. There's ones on there's like 3 or 4. I haven't read all of them. But you got it. David's poll questions are cones.
What?
That gives me a lot more credit than is due, but I will totally take it. Yeah, but it's a fantastic book, just as an exploration of various ideas, and at least in Buddhism, for that, through at least the Dalai Lama's perspective.
Now, is Daniel Goldman, is he the same one that did the Book of Joy as well? The conversation with the Dalai Lama and who
I
was
believe
it?
so.
Yes, it was
Maybe.
Desmond Tutu, I think. Okay.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
maybe.
We're having
Sounds like
book
something you would
nerd
do.
moment. Yeah, and he was mentioning in that book another book that he had done, and I wasn't sure what he was referring to, and I bet it was Destructive Emotions. Okay, I'm going to research that on Goodreads in a minute. To be continued with that one. I'm just going to look on your Goodreads and just copy. Okay, and on that note, let's move to Q&A. Okay, we have selected quite a few questions. I think you have addressed several of them so far, so if I accidentally ask one that you've already covered, we'll just move on. And Rob, feel free to jump in here with me too.
Want to do every other one?
Yeah, let's do that. Yeah, and so the first one you have touched on already. I don't know if you want to say any more about it. The question of, is it necessary to believe in reincarnation to be Buddhist? And I think you've kind of told us that there is no one single necessary doctrine. So we'll go on to the next.
Reincarnation wasn't even developed until the 4th or 5th century. I mean, it just kind of like the doctrine of sin. Like, it literally didn't even exist until Council of Nicaea. Like, I mean, really, it wasn't something anybody paid attention to until several hundred years later. So, I mean, yeah.
So somebody asked, and I'm a little confused about this too. The way they put it was how much of Buddhism ties to Hinduism, and I might reverse that too. I'm not even sure which one came first, or am I totally mixing up the genres?
Well, Hinduism had been around for a long time before. Yeah. So that one definitely came first. Interestingly enough, I mean, Keown in his book goes into, so for instance, like, eventually the Mahayana version of Buddhism seemed to take on, allusions to Christianity to a degree, where there was the notion of salvation in the masses, that bodhisattvas were here almost like priests to bring people into the fold and to teach, central truths. He notes, I think correctly, that it's a little too easy to start making these connections when there was already, for that matter, a tendency towards that kind of thinking, even in Hinduism, which predates Christianity by quite a lot. So it's more of a recognition that a lot of, these are all people. And we tend to have tendencies towards, limiting our ideas to make them manageable. So, there are certain aspects, and this is where we get into, like, there are kernels in what Siddhartha, taught that, that because they weren't fully defined, because that's not what he wanted to do, people ran with them later and did their own thing. And that's just a tendency we all have.
Okay. Well, let's see. We've got a few more. Let's see if we can get through a couple more before we need to wrap up. Oh, this is a good one. Someone was asking if you could tell us again the name of the series of books that you have behind you that does the short introductions to topics.
It's basically just a very short introduction.
Excellent. They are
That's
aptly named then, it sounds like.
it's just, and then you label it. I'm actually I'm on a quest this year to read one a week, which will get me through, I think, all but two or three that I have. So I am not quite keeping up with it, but I'm gonna try. So yeah,
The journey is the important part. You told us that earlier.
it is. Well, and so yes, are they actually? Some of them do. They have a lot of for instance, just got done with earlier one on the classics. Looking at the culture of early Greece and Rome, and lots of pictures of just the architecture and how things flowed back and forth between what the architecture was telling people about the ideas that they were espousing. It's really fascinating. Yeah.
It all being about the path and the climb is a Miley Cyrus song, I believe. Is she a Buddhist?
If it helps her sell tickets, I'm sure she'll say yes.
So, all right, there's a question. Once you strip away all the supernatural elements of Buddhism, what would you say is the essential philosophical argument of it?
I'd say the essential argument is that we enter into the world with a predilection towards unhealthy attachment, and that to reduce it, if not necessarily, get rid of it entirely, one has to engage in behaviors that allow us to recognize that all of this is ephemeral, that it's all going to pass, and that we take and appreciate the joy and where we find it, even as it itself will also pass. There's actually a incredible meditative technique that I do not highly recommend to just anybody because it can be a little destabilizing. But there's variations on this, but it's meditation on death, where you actively consider the deterioration of your own body and the cessation of your own being, and really getting into just this notion of, right, I, whatever that even means, am going to cease at some point, and that's okay. And it's it's a profoundly freeing moment to have.
Okay.
Yeah, DBT is there are many aspects of DBT that took from some contemplative traditions.
Well, I'm not used to guests reading the chat and answering directly. I didn't know what you're talking about, but there I see it. Okay. Yes.
So yeah.
So I have another timeline question. I often heard that a lot of Jesus's philosophy, or the philosophy attributed to Jesus in the Bible, was because Buddhism had seeped into the Middle East. Is that true? Is the timeline of that work out?
Yeah. I'm not not an ideological historian on that. I tend to get very wary of without obviously concrete examples. The earliest mention of anything related to Buddhism wasn't until like the mid to late 3rd century in the West. So odds are no, it wasn't. There's been some contemplation that, for instance, Paul's writing and was influenced by Eastern thought. Maybe, but there's just, as far as I'm aware, happy to be proven wrong. But as far as I'm aware, there's really no data that backs that up. It's more of a, wow, this is some really, it's almost like, what's the idea with evolution where there are
Convergent evolution.
Yeah. Ideologies work the same way. I mean, it's just, there are tendencies within the human psyche to go down certain paths, and yeah,
or
it just
also
tends to happen.
possibly we're cherry picking and seeing patterns where there really aren't any, just to match things up.
Yeah, yeah. Just because the cloud looks like a chicken does not mean it actually is one. So yeah.
All human societies did not learn how to build pyramid-shaped things from aliens, you're saying?
Yes, they did. I
No.
see it on the History
Yeah.
Channel. How could they be wrong? It's
Yeah, I
the
said it in the History
History
Channel.
Channel.
Yes.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, on that note, okay, no, actually, I do have one final question, David. So, would you say that you consider yourself a Buddhist, or do you just practice elements of Buddhism, or am I asking the wrong question?
I really don't like putting a label on it. No, there are definitely a lot of. I would, if for that poll question, if I had to choose a
Mhm.
religion, if I just had to, like somebody like, what are you going to do? That would be it. It wouldn't be an issue for me at all. There are aspects of it that are just really really helpful. And for those who want to, the other one around stoicism, the reality is there's a whole lot of overlap between the two. So if you want to jettison, the religious elements, oh, I don't even want to deal with it. Just go study the Stoics. You're going to get a lot of the same ideas without, it will come with its own set of baggage, but it won't come with the religious baggage from Buddhism. So, yeah.
Fair enough. I like it. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap up there and we'll move into the hangout here in just a second. And David, are you going to be able to stick around at all for the hangout?
Mm-hmm.
Awesome.
Yep.
I
Not a
thought you
problem.
probably would. Okay. Then real quickly, we'll move into that. And don't forget, we'll be back here again next week. Same bat time, same bat channel. And we're going to have Jason Friedman on, and we're going to go from talking about being a Buddhist atheist to being a skeptic. So look forward to that one. And if you want to catch more RfRx episodes before next week, don't forget to check out our YouTube channel. And you can find them there, as well as the audio only versions on wherever you get your podcasts. And you can send questions, comments, ideas that you'd like to see in future shows to us at rfrx@recoveringfromreligion.org. And don't forget to check out our blog and our podcast for even more content. And
102 YouTubes right now, and half of them I think are David.
yeah, and Rob. We got a lot of Rob on there too.
Nowhere near.
Well, Rob, where can people find us on the social medias?
Oh, we're all over the social medias. We have Facebook, we have TikTok. What else do we have? We're on still on the Twitter. That's still existing, I think, right?
Yes,
So
I believe it is.
yes. It would, helpful for people to share our announcements when we make RfRx announcements and that sort of thing. We have a Facebook support group, which is facebook.com RfR Support Group Project. And Twitter is RfR.org. And Instagram even. Instagram is RfR.org also. And TikTok, there's some there, and it's growing. And that's, let's see, our name there is Recovering from Religion, the full title of the organization.
Yes, absolutely. And I think we'll have Dr. Ray coming back on now. Dr. Ray, did you have anything else to share with us?
Just a couple things. First of all, thanks again, David. We always enjoy what you've got to say, and it's like drinking from a fire hose when I watch you talk. I'm thinking we could do a whole talk on that piece, or you could do a whole talk on that piece. It's just too much. But anyway, you always challenge everybody, I think, including myself, to rethink some things. I didn't go through Buddhism per se, but I did read Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha. And guess where I read it? While I was in seminary. That will slow your Christian thinking down quite a bit. But anyway, I did enjoy that piece, and that kind of got me asking some questions about my semi-fundamentalist raising. Anyway, thanks again for coming and giving us a great deal to think about.